welcome everyone to our panel on Professor Brand's new book, or published a year ago almost, on the first Civil War, the American Revolution. And we have the two distinguished panelists who will be kind of engaging with the book. Bill will have about 10 minutes, and the Professor Tooley will have 10 minutes, and Bob will have 10 minutes, and then we'll open up this for discussion. But to begin with, we'll have an introduction by Diana Heredia, who is our graduate student assistant here at the Institute of Institute of Historical Studies, who is a fifth-year graduate student working on the history of 16th century globalization of commodities in the New World to Europe and the rest of the world. So, Diana, please.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. If you haven't done so already, you can help yourself to refreshments, and just a quick reminder that everything is compostable, so you can just put it in the compost bin that's over there. And also welcome to our online attendance. Thank you. So today with us we have, we're discussing Dr. H.W. Brand's not latest book, but he is a professor of history and Jack S. Blanton Senior Chair in the History at the University of Texas at Austin. He has written 36 books, co-authored or edited more than 5 others, and published dozens of articles and scores of reviews. His most recent book, The Last Campaign, Sherman, Geronimo, and the War of America, is just out this month on Doubleday. And the book under discussion today, Our First Civil War, Patriots and Loyalists in the American Revolution, was published 1 year ago this month in November 2021. Several of his books have been bestsellers, and 2, The First American and Traitor to His Class, were finalists for the Pulitzer Prize and the Los Angeles Times Prize. And with us too, we have 2 distinguished discussants, as Jorge just told us. First, Dr. Robert A. Olwell. He's an associate professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin. His book publications include Envisioning Empire, The New British World, 1763-1773, co-edited with James Bond on Bloomsbury in 2020. Likewise, he published Cultures and Identities in Colonial British America, which was co-edited with our other discussant, Dr. Alan Tolley, on Johns Hopkins University Press in 2006. And Masters, Slaves and Subjects, The Culture of Power in the South Carolina Low Country, 1740-1790, on Cornell University Press back in 1988. His latest book, a monograph entitled Imaginary Empire, British Adventures in Florida on the Eve of the American Revolution, is under contract with the University of Pennsylvania Press. And also with us too, Dr. Alan Tolley, who is a scholar of early American history. He holds the Eugene C. Barker Centennial Professorship in American History, and is currently serving as interim chair of history at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Tolley has written 2 well-known books on colonial political culture, William Penn's Legacy, Politics and Social Structure in Provincial Pennsylvania, 1726 to 1755, and Forming American Politics, Ideals, Interests, and Institutions in Colonial New York and Pennsylvania, both with Johns Hopkins University Press. Thank you for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for that introduction. And we have a large group of participants, about 64 participants, so we have a good crowd.
Very good.
You're drawing all sorts of people into events of the Institute. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Jorge Cañizares Guerra. I am the director of the Institute. So without further ado.
Okay, well, thank you, Jorge. Thank you to the Institute for inviting us here. Thank you all for coming. Give me a chance to talk about this book that I wrote. It's been a long time in the thinking. I have made a point of teaching the survey of US history, so there's the whole time I've been in this business. And it requires me, one of the reasons I do it is it requires me to go over these fundamental questions of American history, and to do so in a fairly concise manner. Those of you who have taught the survey know you have maybe a lecture to deal with something as momentous as the American Revolution and the Civil War. And so you have to figure out, so what are you going to say? And how are you going to make this relevant? How are you going to persuade the students that what happened was reasonable? At least it seemed reasonable to the people at the time. So maybe it's an advancing age, or maybe it is just this fact that I'm trying to make this stuff relevant to students who are, the students here at UT are smart students, they're well prepared, but of course they're much younger than I am, and they come from a different place. So I wanted to kind of pose the basic, what I consider the basic moral question. And morality here is political and other kinds of ramifications that underlay the American Revolution. And the way I pose the question is, what prompts a person to forsake his or her country and take arms against it? You know, this is a big step, and it's not taken lightly. And in fact, I have posed this question to audiences at various times over the last few years while I was working on this book. Is there anything that your government, and I'm speaking mostly to American audiences, your government would do that was cause you to say, I no longer recognize this government, I no longer am bound by its laws, and go beyond that to join a military force to overthrow it? And I'm going to say, sort of thankfully, it hasn't happened recently, and I think by and large it's a good thing. But when I put it in those terms, when I put in those terms to these audiences, I'm trying to get at the fact that it was a huge step for the people who made this decision in the 1770s and 1780s. And I'm trying to recapture the fact that it was a big deal, because when we get used to history, and especially when we know how things turned out, then it's tempting to think, well, it was obvious, it was inevitable that that was what was going to happen. But I'm trying to push things back to the time when it wasn't obvious or inevitable at all. And I try to put the burden of explaining the change or justifying the action on those people who, in a typical introductory course or in the general conventional view of American history, their role doesn't have to be explained at all. So the title of the book is Our First Civil War. And then the subtitle is Patriots and Loyalists in the American Revolution. And I think it's probably fair to say, in the general understanding of the American Revolution and the war that it gave rise to, that it's very tempting for American audiences and readers to assume that, well, of course, George Washington was going to take up arms against Britain. And of course, Benjamin Franklin was going to forsake his attachment to this empire that he had grown up under and say, okay, your laws no longer bind me. And beyond that, I'm going to wage war to enforce this separation. And well, because we know how it turned out, we know that, well, George Washington was going to go on to become the father of his country. Except George Washington didn't know that in the 1760s and 1770s. And he was making this leap into the unknown. So this is part of the genesis of the book, why I took on this project and the angle that I took. The other thing was that I had been recently writing about the era of the American Civil War, which, after having written this book and employed this title, Our First Civil War, I called the other Civil War, the one in the 1860s. It just seemed something was brought to my attention that is obvious to any student of this era, but it's worth a reminder that the American Revolution was not Americans against the British. I mean, that was part of it, but it was really almost as much Americans against Americans, because the hard fighting, the ideological conflict, the political conflict, and much of the military conflict was between and among Americans. And so what we call the Revolutionary War, the Revolution, it was as much a civil war as it was a revolution. It was as much a conflict among Americans, among communities of Americans, sometimes among American families, as it was a revolution of a nationalist uprising, the people of one country against a colonial overlord. And in some ways, it was even more of a civil war than that other civil war, because that other civil war, actually, I mean, it was fought within the boundaries, at least the boundaries as conceived of by the Union, of a single country. But it quickly, I mean, it originated in this one geographic bloc against another geographic bloc. And there clearly was enemy territory. You knew where the lines were. And it was presumed that if you were in Virginia, after Virginia voted to secede, if you were in Georgia or Texas, that the presumption was that Confederate law, Virginia law, Texas law applied to you, and the law of the United States no longer did. And so it was in effect, well, a war between two parts of this formerly united country. And that's the way it was fought out. There were guerrilla actions in the border states, and there was some of that stuff, even within the boundaries of the Confederacy and of the Union. But the fighting was mostly mass troops against mass troops, and it was sort of clear, who was on one side or the other. In the case of the American Revolutionary War, there were loyalists and there were patriots within single families, and there were certainly the divisions within communities and within states. And so it was often very unclear where the lines between patriots and loyalists lay. There was another aspect of this too, and this was really clear in the way strategy played out between, I'll call it the Patriot side and the Loyalist British side. And that was, and I think John Adams was probably the one who invented the phrase, or at least the first one to make it used in an American context. There's a war for the hearts and minds of people. Where does your loyalty lie? And if you want to look at the strategy of the British, just sort of military/political strategy of the British, and the military/political strategy of the independent US government, it's as much about gaining or retaining support of different groups of Americans as it is about fending off British military force or negating American military force on the other side. So there's that aspect of it as well. And I think every historian, and I contrast historians here to political scientists and other social scientist types, we are definitely all splitters rather than lumpers. And the more complicated things get, the more interesting they become. And so I just love the complications that came along in this story. Because as I say, if you have to explain the American Revolution in 25 words, it's Americans get tired of British rule, they declare independence, wage war, now they're an independent country. Okay. But of course, it's much more complicated than that. And this is the story that I tell. One last thing on this, and it sort of is the approach that I cannot help myself adopting when I write history. And that is all my histories, they become biographical in some sense or not biographical of me, of my subject. And I remember trying to write a dissertation here at UT back in the 1980s. And it was on American foreign policy. And it was the foreign policy of the Eisenhower administration. And I don't know exactly how I first came to do this, but it wound up being a collective biography of key foreign policymakers in the Eisenhower administration. So there were chapters on John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles and various Henry Cabot Lodge, who was an ambassador to the UN, and people like this. So I find that I am drawn to explain history in the actions, the words of individuals. I have occasionally tried to write what sort of used to be called social history, where it's a history of a class of people or history of people in the mass. And I cannot get myself to do it, in part because what drew me to history in the first place was the opportunity to meet people who were different than me, people who lived at a different time, different places. And it was their words that drew me in. I remember, this will mean something to many of you in the room, but my grandfather somehow or other had acquired the complete works of Hubert Howe Bancroft. And there's no reason that anybody on earth besides a library should own the complete works. But my grandfather was a sucker for itinerant book sales. And there used to be such things, I guess, back in the 30s and 40s. And they got this. And in my one year of escape from the academic world, between kindergarten and now, when I was a student and I was an undergraduate and graduated, and I spent 1 year working out in the real world before coming back to teaching. And in that year, I was a traveling salesman. I didn't sell books, I sold cutlery, knives and scissors. But before heading off on my journeys across the American West, I would go raid my grandfather's library and I'd pull down a couple of volumes from Bancroft and I would take them along with me. And I was naive in the nature of what passed for professional or polished histories. And nobody today would think of these works as great works of history. He still has his name on the research library at Berkeley, but nobody writes books like it. As a professional historian, you can't get away with writing this stuff. But was exactly what appealed to me, because in many ways, they're kind of data dumps of the journals, the diaries, the letters he had acquired. And so I remember reading the accounts of people who were engaged in exploration across the Intermountain region of the American West, while I was driving across that very region. And I thought, this is fascinating, because I got to meet these people. So when I decided to take on this question of the American Revolution, I had to identify several individuals, basically half of them who would become patriots, and half of whom would become, or I have to remind myself, would remain loyalists. And again, I'll expand on this briefly. When you know how it turned out, then you think that the people who have to be explained are the loyalists. Why didn't they come along? These are the losers of history. But I want to turn this on its head and say, no, it's the patriots, the rebels, who have to be explained. So there's not much to explain as to why William Franklin remained loyal to the British Crown, because he basically went to his office. He was the governor of New Jersey, the royal governor of New Jersey, and he'd go to his office every day, and he just kept doing the same thing, the same thing, the same thing. And all of a sudden, one day, he woke up and found himself declared a traitor. He hadn't done anything to be a traitor. No, the conditions had changed on him. New Jersey had decided to rebel against the Union, and they declared him persona non grata and threw him in prison. Whereas somebody like George Washington, he's the one who has to be explained. So anyway, this is maybe my nod a little bit to social science. So where I do these case studies, and I try to figure out what it is that makes these people become patriots, what it is that makes these other people remain loyalists. And this is the story that I tell. So I'll start there.
Thank you.
I'm gonna go
Go ahead.
first.
Oh, you
actually.
go first.
I just want to pull my lower rank.
Okay.
Go first. Yeah, there's a thing I think Edmund Burke said once about when people talk about constitutions, it's a sign of illness in the body politic. And now, why is everyone putting Civil War on the cover of their books now? It makes me wonder with Jeremy's book and your book.
Yeah.
Any else?
Yeah. Probably a sign of some sickness in the body politic, I suspect. But I teach a revolution lecture course, and I started the semester with pictures of January 6th.
Mhm.
And all these don't try to be flags, and then and people in revolutionary wear clothes. And I was trying to make a point about what are they taking from the revolution that's leading them, inspiring this. And then we got to talk about that. And perhaps going too far, I said, if maybe 25 years from now, this event will be celebrated like the Boston Massacre or the Stamp Act riots as the beginning of a revolution. But right now it makes me think the Loyalists were right, and as I taught this course, I really think like the Loyalists are the only sensible people in the room, because they're just saying, relax, things will work out. They're not saying, the king is ordained of God. Very few say that. Right. They're not even saying that the British government's acting wisely. They're just saying, in a Burkean way, just be patient, the government will correct itself. And the revolutionaries are the ones who are got their hair on fire and so on. And so that's an interesting, think about where loyalists stand in our kind of imagination. You start with this horrific example of the Waxhaws massacre, where basically Americans are killing Americans after they surrender in North Carolina. But you really leave that after that. I mean, we come back a little bit, but for most of it, we retreat to these large figures,
Yeah.
Franklin, Galloway.
Right.
And I don't know if the meeting's kind of a tease, or why don't we ever come
Yeah,
back?
it
Because
is.
things get really, as we go back to the South, and things could really get messy, as you know.
Right.
There's a kind of, you talk about splitters and lumpers. I guess my inclination, I would say that you either see the forest or the trees, and I tend to like just want to stare at one tree excessively.
Yeah.
So you can just the granularity you can get into.
Yeah.
At that particular battle you start with.
Yeah, do you mind if I respond to that?
Oh, go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question about it. I'm looking for a hook to bring people in, but it does make the point. And I think this is, I mean, you certainly feel free to dispute this, but the bitterest fighting, the nastiest fighting was American on American. And I think it's natural, given the fact that if you think about it for a minute, American soldiers had nothing personal against British soldiers, nothing personal against the Hessians or anything like that. When soldiers are soldiers, that's it. But when you know the person on the other side, and when you have reason to feel betrayed by the person on the other side, then it gets personal, and then it gets really brutal. And so, yeah, I led it my best shot. And indeed, I confess that there are people who have been led by that prologue to think that this was going to be a count of the military campaigns.
Right.
And then I really don't spend a lot of time on the military campaigns.
Right.
And and I'm going to confess to this, that just as the writer of history, the teller of a story, going back to Homer, war sells, because stuff happens in war, important stuff. People's lives are on the line, people die. In most of our lives, that doesn't happen. The biggest thing that I have to decide today is where am I going to have lunch, or that sort of thing. But I think one of the enduring appeals of military history is that big questions are in play, and it's very personal for everybody who goes into battle. Will I be brave? Will I run? Will I live? Will I die? So I confess to using that,
Right.
but it does underscore the larger point that there is this civil war going on. There is this, then whether I call it a civil war or not, and that's kind of decided, but that's a hook too. But it really is, I'm making a point that it's American on American.
But see, I would say, like, maybe the term American.
Excuse me, Professor. Could you face this way so we can hear
I'm
you?
trying to face the camera, but I can face this way, I guess.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if these guys thought of themselves as fellow Americans. That Tarleton's unit was recruited in Philadelphia, New York. The guys they're fighting are Virginians. I don't think necessarily they thought these are fellow Americans. They're certainly traitors to the king or
Right.
whatever, but so I think
Yeah.
actually a
exactly.
month after the Waxhaws battle that you talk about, there's an even worse one very nearby at a place called Ramser's Mill. And that's literally neighbors fighting neighbors.
Yeah.
Because Tory militia in North Carolina, they're gathering and their Patriot neighbors literally attack them.
Yeah.
And it's just, as you say, vicious. They don't take prisoners. And
Right. Yeah.
so that's very much the kind of
Right.
thing.
Yeah.
You're going.
I will confess also that there's definitely a problem in terminology.
Right. Right.
Because on the one hand, I can distinguish Americans from the British, yeah, but then I get these different groups of Americans, and they didn't all call themselves Whigs or Tories or Patriots or Loyalists. They were Americans. Yeah.
And if I can just jump in, I mean, it's the complexity again. What you say is true in these southern battles by and large, where you switch up to the north. I mean, you get the Native American kind of element.
Oh, yeah.
And
yeah.
how, I mean, you do bring that in, don't misunderstand me,
right.
but again, it's the complexities of these different coalitions and participants in different ways, which last significantly through, right up through the 1780s, 81,
Yeah.
and onwards in some areas. I mean, there's no conclusion to some of those things as well. Anyway, I'm sorry.
And so one of the points that I would try to bring out in this is that I think to an unusual degree, almost everybody in America has to choose sides. And that is in the nature of a really civil war. Because, if we accept, and there's reasons to dispute it, if we accept John Adams's characterization at the beginning of this, it was about a third Whigs, about a third Tories, and about a third in the middle. And it is to the advantage of the two outlying sides to make the ones in the middle make a choice. And so George Washington has to decide. But in fact, So do the enslaved people on George Washington's plantation after the British offered freedom to the slaves of Patriot masters, of rebel masters. And the Native Americans had to choose sides. So I focus on Joseph Brand, the Mohawk leader. And he's got to decide, okay, so which way do we go here? And some of it's based on existing loyalties. Some of it's based on expectations regarding the future. Who's going to win? What happens if this side wins? How are we going to be treated? What happens if that side wins? How are we going to be treated?
Since this is kind of more free flow, just let me jump in. I mean, I think one of the really interesting things, Bill, is when you look at the movement of peoples during these 7 years, you look out in what becomes Tennessee and Kentucky, there's a huge pile of people who move out into that area. They don't want anything to do with this choice.
Yeah.
You know, one thing is choice, and you're right about people having to choose in certain circumstances. But there are a whole pile of people that by 70, 79, even after, you know, the French are in, you know, there's a whole pile of people who pack up and say, I don't want any of this bloody thing. I want to get out of here. And that's when you look at the population map and you just see it explodes out there in that period, which of course exacerbates some of the problems related to frontier native people and so on. Anyway, I find that as a
No, I think it's great to point that out.
an aversion to the continuing kind of conflict, because this is a long bloody.
It is, and
You know, that's the thing that we forget. So
it underscores. I think,
longer than the Civil War. I mean, you know.
Oh, yeah. I think it underscores a general principle. In most conflicts, most people don't want to get involved. They just want to go about doing their business. But you get in one of these situations where the two sides try to force you to make a choice. So when George Washington was at Valley Forge, he sends his provisioners out in the countryside and say, okay, you got to find us something to eat. And you can push these people hard, but don't push them too hard, because then they'll go flip side and join the British. And the British found themselves in the same situation. It also underscores that this is true of every war, that they begin in politics and they end in politics. And this is one, and this get back to Edmund Burke, as Bob was saying, you know, that's the way this thing ended. The government fell in Britain. The new government said, okay, well, we can do it. I mean, the fall was forced by things that happened in North America, but still, these are political decisions that are made. And the American Revolutionary War was one that was really not decided on the battlefield. And it's almost never the case that one side is so crushed that it simply cannot continue to fight. It's that the losers decide we will not continue to fight. The British could have fought this war for another 20 years if they wanted to. They'd been as stubborn as the United States and Afghanistan in this century, but they didn't. And so in some ways, Washington knew, and the British commanders knew, that they had two audiences. There was the audience in America, can Washington keep the support for the Continental Army? And then in the British, because the British government is actually going to determine when this war is over. And it's a fundamental principle of wars, but the wars don't end at the behest or on the decision of the winners. They end only when the loser says enough is enough and we will stop fighting. And that's how this war ended. The British said, okay, we're going to stop fighting. It's not worth it anymore. And this is why Washington understood that he didn't have to win. He really didn't have to win any battles. He just had to avoid losing his army. And as long as he could keep the army in the field, then it would keep raising the cost to the British. And eventually, as you hope, the British would say, enough is enough, we're out of here. Didn't mean to.
No, that's good.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess this is not in the book, so it's not even a fair question, but I'd like to have your thoughts about, like, I guess, is there a loyalist ideology, a loyalist personality? If we look at this 1/3, and that statistic has been critiqued, as you know,
Sure.
but let's say that the percentage were who remained loyal. What divide? How are they different from the rest?
I'd like to be able to say that there is no clear predictor that says that you're going to be a loyalist and you're going to be a patriot. I like to say, because I think it makes a more interesting story, that it is much more idiosyncratic. And so I point out that Benjamin Franklin became a rebel and William Franklin remained a loyalist. And here are two men who had similar interests, and they have much the same view on life and all this. But I will say this, that many of the people who remained loyalists were people who had important and attractive positions with the British government. And so Thomas Hutchins, he's on the other hand, and he was a loyalist. He was lieutenant governor and then governor of Massachusetts, and he remained loyal. And one might say, well, okay, so he was just, following his employer. His bread was buttered on that side, so that's what you would expect. And William Franklin the same way. Now, on the other hand, Benjamin Franklin was an employee of the British Crown as well. He was the postmaster for North America. One could argue that, well, he was independently wealthy by this time, so he could afford to be a rebel.
What about Joseph Galloway?
So there's another one. Now, he's a really interesting one. And this is where I can't say that everybody who was for the British was, their livelihood in British. Galloway's a really interesting one because until the moment of decision, he's hardly indistinguishable from Franklin. And the two were allies. They were William Franklin. They were allies. They all agreed, and this is, I say, across the board. I think you made this point well, that almost none of the loyalists, almost none of the defenders of the British Crown said that everything Parliament did was right. Many of them were as critical of the Stamp Act as any of the Sam Adams or anybody else. But it's just, as you say, catch your breath. Yeah, things will right themselves, and you don't have to blow this place up. Benjamin Franklin, memorably likened the British Empire to this Chinese vase, this Chinese vase that was this beautiful thing, but once it's broken, you can't put it back together. And I think Franklin was speaking for himself in particular that way. But Franklin, he's a striking one because I would say, in many ways, he's the least likely rebel you would encounter. Because George Washington, he could argue that, I'm going to be, I would have accomplished what I accomplished, whether there was a British Empire around or not, because he was a Virginian, really more than he was a citizen of the empire. And he had done well, he had married well, and he had respect and all this stuff. Franklin, though, Franklin's brilliant success. One of the questions I pose to students is, if there had never been an American Revolution, which of these people that we identify with the generation of the founding would the world ever have heard of? Would the world have heard of Thomas Jefferson? Quite likely not. He became famous because he wrote the Declaration of Independence. No revolution, no declaration. George Washington, Virginia planter, really almost never got out of Virginia. And so the world wouldn't have heard of him. The only one that we know the world would have heard of was Benjamin Franklin, because the world had heard of him. He was famous, the world famous before the American Revolution. And Franklin understood that he owed his success to the British Empire. It wasn't just Boston, which he ran away from. It wasn't just Philadelphia, which he sort of ran away from too. And he wound up in London. And he knew that there was no other political entity on earth in which this poor boy from the provinces could have succeeded at the metropolitan center as well as he had. Nothing except the British Empire where this would have happened. So he wasn't simply a supporter of the British Empire. He was an enthusiast of the British Empire. So it really took a lot to push him over the edge. And this is where, so one of the things I tell my students is that history operates on a couple of tracks. There's what I call, we call big history. And that's the history of public life, public affairs. It's declarations of war, it's industrial revolutions, it's stuff like that, constitutions. And then there's little history, sort of meta history and micro history. And the little history, the micro history is what happens to you. And my grandfather bought Bancroft's work. By the way, he also bought the complete works of Sir Walter Scott. And there's no reason anybody should have those. My father happened to have that, is it 7 volumes that Douglas Freeman did on George Washington, the biography, something like that, multi-volumes. And my dad used to point at that on his bookshelf in his study. And my dad was not a historian, he was a businessman, but somehow or other, he started reading on that. And once my dad started reading something, he'd keep reading. And he said proudly, having read that, I know what George Washington had for breakfast every day of his life. And it's pretty much that detail. But that's little history. And so for explaining Joseph Galloway, right as that matters, explaining Benjamin Franklin, what was it? And go ahead.
No, please finish.
Oh, okay. I mean, I was going to say, there is something very personal about it for Franklin, because I think Franklin understood that the war was going to disrupt this wonderful thing. Franklin had this vision for a transatlantic British Empire. If only the British would allow the colonies, which were growing much faster than the home country in population and in wealth, if the government in London would allow the what would become the United States, would allow the American colonies to rise up to a level of equality, then there would be this transatlantic empire with two strong pillars. And he thought this would go on forever. He was almost sort of the early version of what Winston Churchill finally circled around back to, this special relationship. But Franklin, he really got ticked off when he was berated, accused of being a liar, a traitor, and everything, for what was an effort on Franklin's behalf to give the British government an out, to appease the Sam Adams wing in Boston by basically putting all the blame for bad British policies on Thomas Hutchinson. Because there were these purloined letters that somebody put in Franklin's hands, and then Franklin sent them to Boston so that the leaders in Boston could see, as Franklin hoped. See, it wasn't this plot in Parliament. They were being given bad advice by Hutchinson. Now, I do not know if Franklin was sincere in that part of it, but it was as much a construct as anything else, because if the British government, if the king wanted to disavow the policy, all he had to do was fire Hutchinson and hire somebody else. And then that would seem to indicate that there was room in London for coming to terms. But this backfired on Franklin, and he was hauled before the Privy Council and was criticized up one side and down the other. And I exaggerate a little bit when I say, I don't exactly say this in the book, but it's not too much to say that Franklin walked into that session. This is in January of 1774. And he walks into that session a loyal Englishman, and he walks out a rebel American. And, it's, again, I exaggerate, I take some artistic license there. But in Franklin's case, I think it was very deeply personal, and which also perhaps explains why his son did not become a rebel, because his son did not have that personal experience. So anyway, it's this intersection of big history and little history, the macro and the micro, that I find to be the most interesting aspect of history.
Does the store is open to questions?
Yeah, please.
You want to say something?
No.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think your emphasis on Franklin is right, though, in a lot of ways, and I admire your earlier treatment of him, years ago, which again kind of sharpened in some way here. But I think, the thing that both reinforces what you say about Franklin, but also explains Galloway to an extent, is that whole campaign for royal government, which takes place in Pennsylvania. I mean, what you have to understand, for the audience audience members who don't understand this quite as much, you have to really emphasize the autonomy of these different colonies. There is no United States. There's no, even by 1774, it's not even clear that anybody had any idea of a really effective kind of union, I don't think. Right. So all of these places have separate kind of histories, and it's chaos in a kind of way, but it's chaos within a provincial sort of framework. And in Pennsylvania, which was one of the, you could say, the big three, as I think it's bigger in some ways than New York in the 1740s and 1750s. There's deep animus to the guy who's the proprietor of that, which is Thomas Penn, William Penn's son. And there's this whole kind of campaign that develops in Pennsylvania, which is directed against Penn as proprietor, and they want to turn Pennsylvania into a royal government. All right, with a standard kind of form. And that's the way Galloway's influenced a lot by that, along with his, he's a Quaker. He's a secular Quaker, if you will, ultimately by the time of the Revolution, but he also is a Quaker, and friends at that time, they try to hew the middle ground in here. So it's not so surprising that Galloway, because of his political influence and or his political interests, and his background within the Society of Friends, really lean towards loyalism, if you will. Franklin, however, is, you're right. He's got this vision, I think, and You know, I would emphasize that even more. I mean, that he's this visionary in some ways. I mean, there's nobody that's comparable to Franklin in that sense.
Right.
And I think you're right. I mean, you know, it's very personal for him in a lot of ways. And he thinks outside the box. You know, I mean, can I just go on here for a second? You know, I mean, here's here, speaking of ideology and so on. Okay, here's what William says, and this really raises an important question. You quote him, Bill, and yeah, let me preface this by saying I think one of the great things about this book is the extent to which you simply quote with so many of these prominent kinds of figures. You know, I mean, you integrate this really well with your own good writing in a sense, and there's stuff here. You know, there are long quotations in here which I haven't read in years or have missed in some ways, and you got a really discerning eye about this, and so you see this, you know, these quotations. This is you know, this kind of period of time reflected in the minds and in the writings of a particular group of individuals who are particularly insightful about where they are and what all of this means. Now, again, you could say what's left out of here is the fact that Sam Adams and Charles Thompson, who were the two most radical figures in the revolution and were insiders, they burned their papers.
Right.
Both of them. And they did so because they said, nobody's going to tell the story about the revolution. We really know what happened. And we're not going to have, it'll only undermine the kind of mythology that they wanted there. But these are people who left this kind of record. So here's William, you know, on page 234. The widening breach between the two countries so far as to let in an independent Republican tyranny, the worst and most debasing of all possible tyrannies. Now, you know, here, I mean, you really have to think about what's going on in the minds of these people. And this is kind of the issue of ideology. You can understand this if you understand that the orthodox view of kind of all the benefits that flow from a belonging within the British Empire, all the benefits flow fundamentally from this mixed and balanced constitution. And that's the predominant orthodoxy that runs through all. It's the genius of the British Constitution. You know, it's lionized. These people believe this, you know. And the problem here, once you get to independence, or even before, you stop and think about it, you know, if you cut the king's head off, you're robbed of monarchy. There is no embodied class of aristocrats or aristocracy. This, what you're left for is one of the worst forms of government possible, a pure democracy. And Americans are, you know, the colonists are backing into a democracy which everybody knows is chaotic. It's mobocracy. And that's pretty obvious from the mobs in here too. So here's William, who is really well educated. He's bought into this completely. Franklin, on the other hand, you know, has this imaginative mind, and he's more attuned with what goes on in Pennsylvania, which is there's, you know, a singular kind of assembly, which essentially runs the show in Pennsylvania. And he's much more comfortable with this kind of framework, if you will. So it's easier in some ways for him to do this, to take this position than his son William. So I'm sorry, that's just a long kind of.
I think that's fascinating. I think it also betrays an aspect of Franklin's personality and temperament, in that Franklin really believed that it was possible for people to act on basis of civic virtue. That he thought that reasonable people could sit down. He wasn't one who believed that if left to their own devices, people would just run the country into the ground.
I think he believed that by the time he's in his late 60s. Franklin has a really vindictive strain in him.
Oh, yeah.
You could see this in the 1750s, 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Yeah.
I mean, he really has another side to it.
Right.
You know, and I think that kind of age kind of does a little bit to him. Or experience within this.
Yeah.
within this law.
And I gotta confess here that I wrote a book about Benjamin Franklin, and then he's a main character in this book. And I'm still not sure that I got Franklin right. I sometimes worry that he's pulled the wool over my eyes this whole time, because no one presented himself as well to the world as Benjamin Franklin did. He always knew that his words mattered. He always knew he was writing for an audience. I mean, certainly after he got to a point where he was famous, he knew that he wasn't going to burn his papers. He was going to make sure that people read his stuff. When he wrote his own stories, his autobiography, it's initially the dear son, he's writing to William, but it's clear he's writing to much more than William. And so he has his audience out there. In fact, I used to have a long conversation. Sometimes I still have this conversation. I have two sisters and a brother. And my sister Lori is one who she has a moral theologian, but she's also a student of what she likes to call the dark side in human nature. She's very drawn to the dark side in human nature. And Lori lives in Vermont and has for a long time. And I've lived in Texas for a long time, but we would meet along with our other siblings and our various children in Oregon, where my parents had a summer house on the Oregon coast. And Lori and I would go for long walks on the beach. And Lori would tell me how I needed to get in touch with my dark side. And so partly to provoke her, being the younger brother, but partly out of conviction. I said, well, I don't know, Lori, does everybody have a dark side? I don't feel as though I have a dark side. She said, well, everybody's got a dark side. And those who say they don't, they're simply in denial. But I might add that one of Lori's favorite authors was D.H. Lawrence. And D.H. Lawrence could not stand Benjamin Franklin from a distance of a century and a half, precisely because Franklin had no dark side. And Franklin was this person who would not allow the dark side, which of course D.H. Lawrence had. And he thought, Franklin doesn't allow, Lawrence said that the human soul is a dark forest, but Franklin won't let me go there. And so I sometimes thought that, well, maybe Franklin did have this dark side, but he kept it very well hidden. And after all these years, hidden from me, because that's one of the things that Lori said. Oh, he's pulled the wool over your eyes. And I would say that there's one thing as much as anything else that makes me think that's a clear possibility. And that is in Benjamin Franklin's relationship with his son, William. After William refuses to follow Benjamin Franklin into rebellion against the king. And one can understand while the war is still on, the estrangement persists because William's on one side, then Franklin's on the other. But then the war ends, and Franklin is able to reconcile with most of his other British friends and associates. And okay, the war's over, let bygones be bygones. But he will not reconcile with William because he has felt that he's been wounded, he's been personally attacked. Now, this is quite odd because William was no more a rebel against his father, Benjamin, than Benjamin was a rebel against his own parents. And lastly, I'll say this is where I try not to project my own values onto the people that I study in history. But I have 3 children, and I try to imagine anything that any of my kids could do that would make me say, you are no longer my son, you are no longer my daughter. Especially if, the occasion for this ended and went away. I simply could not imagine that, but Franklin did that. And this perhaps is the vindictiveness that Alan identified, where it still persists.
That sounds pretty dark.
It is, yeah, exactly. And it still comes out toward William. So
Yeah, you've got a quotation in here, Bill. I can't find it right now. I had it, I underlined it someplace in there. Where he said, fundamentally he says, something about the duties that go to your that children over to their parent. It's not sounded direct quotation, but it's in there. It's a very, very terse kind of comment.
yeah,
And it seems to me that's really, and I had never seen that before. And that's, I think that's it. It really has to do with this issue of obligation of children to their parents in here. And he really sees it in that respect.
yeah, again, which is ironic because Franklin ignored his obligation to his own parents. He ran away from home defiant of his father and the indenture law that bound him to his older brother, and then made his fortune that way. And never seemed to look back or to regret that. But now when it shows up in his own center, this is one where the apple didn't fall from the tree, but Franklin couldn't stand it that it did.
He's also a con man.
Yeah.
You say you can't get it hold of Franklin. Nobody's ever going to get hold of Franklin.
Yeah.
you see moments, you see aspects of the personality, and it changes over time. So,
And as the biographer of Franklin, I gotta say that he was the most, well, when you write about somebody for a long period of time, they essentially become a member of your household, or they're a long-term house guest. And of course, Franklin was the one who, as Poor Richard said, that guests stink after 3 days. But after 5 years of living with Franklin, he was just as congenial as could be. He was always saying something that's, yeah, that sounds perfectly reasonable. Whereas, other people that I've written about, Theodore Roosevelt. So Theodore Roosevelt died at the age of 60, and if he didn't die, then I would have killed him off because he just wore me out. But Franklin, he died at the age of 84, and I confess that as I was writing the final pages of the book, the death scene, I was getting misty-eyed. I'm gonna miss you. Do we have questions from the audience or the audience online?
The audience, yes.
Yeah, so I just want to say, I really appreciate this sort of framing. It's actually always how I, coming from British history, have kind of seen it. So I have two things that I want to say. The first may be a little glib, and that is just asking if you read Smith's defense of the American Revolution. He was kind of the main intellectual, really, and at least in Scotland, that defends it from a British perspective. And he offers analysis as to why that actually kind of goes against one of the things you said, which is, oh, George Washington didn't know that he was going to be a father of the country. Smith's argument is that these people maybe didn't know that they would be, but they saw that possibility. And there is nothing that can enshrine you in history more than being the father of a country, especially because as these British people were looking at America growing very rapidly, they could tell this was going to be a very large, powerful country. So Smith says that he makes a lot of arguments, but he makes this human analysis that emotional drive to become part of history is actually a big reason. It would be very difficult to convince these people to stand down.
Okay.
The second point is just, I was wondering, the Patriot narrative, I think, is kind of becoming more popular around some work Stephen Pincus is doing in the Anglosphere in the 18th century again. And specifically, it's kind of articulating patriotism as a movement that was not quite a political party, but moving towards being a political party separately, but in a related way in England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, and the North American colonies, including Nova Scotia, not just the ones that have become America. And so in that sense, the American Revolution, as well as Wolftone's Revolution later, are just the times when this broader civil conflict actually just comes to the fore as a civil war. I was wondering what your thoughts are on that front, and how we can see this as part of a wider development of, in my opinion, the two strands of liberalism, kind of radical liberalism and the kind of the liberalism that's just purely Whiggish, that really kind of
Just the civil war within the empire,
right, yeah.
transatlantic civil war.
Yeah. So Alan, do you have something?
No, you go ahead, Asher. I mean, I do, I'll say something, but you go ahead first, sure.
So I will say that, yes, there definitely is an element. I think it comes out in Washington in particular regarding the idea that I'm a distinguished man in Virginia. Boy, I could really be great if Virginia were independent. Now, it's not at all clear before the American Revolution what that would mean. Would he become president of Virginia? Because I don't think anybody really was thinking seriously about a United States of America that would have a presidency that he would become. In fact, that takes a whole decade after the Declaration of Independence. You've got to get a constitution to figure out what that's all about. But yes, there is an element, and I think it's more pronounced in Washington than any of the other individuals that I look at who become patriots. And it's sometimes posed in this way, that Washington sized himself up against officers in the British Army during the French and Indian War. And he was there with Braddock at the grave defeat there, and he knew that he had performed better than those other British officers. But British policy was such that he would not advance in the British Army. There was a definite ceiling that provincials had simply because they were provincials. And Washington, having a healthy regard for his own talents, believed that this is preventing me from becoming the person that I can be. So I think there's definitely an aspect of that. And I think that if you look at nationalist revolutions, and here you could certainly include the attempt by the Confederacy to secede from the United States, which is a nationalist revolution that fails. There's a lot of that, because if you create this new country, you have to have a new set of leaders, and you can be the top dog instead of being second on the list. It applies, I think, peculiarly to somebody like Washington. For most people, they're not high enough up that they can aspire to that sort of thing. But in terms of where the American Revolution fits in with the larger revolution, I sure, this is not at all coincidental, that this is toward the beginning of a century of revolutions. And exactly what it's triggered by, I don't know. I'm not one who believes that causality flows in a single direction, but it certainly emerges from the idea, well, the ideas that are articulated in the Declaration of Independence, that this idea that people do have these rights, the rights of the English and Scottish Enlightenment, and they include life and property, or the pursuit of happiness, or in essentially self-government. And once you absorb that idea, then I'm also another believer that ideas have physical and political manifestations, not necessarily all at once, not necessarily in the individuals who are promoting the ideas. But for example, when Thomas Jefferson writes, all men are created equal, I do not know exactly what he meant by that, but I do know that it became this marker that people who accepted Jefferson's articulation at the beginning would strive, and their successors would aim for. So I have a hard time finding 5 words ever written in the English language that had more impact around the world over centuries than all men are created equal. So the idea is out there. Now, what do we do with the idea? And so I think that you start with the revolution in America, and then you get to the French Revolution, which is coming out of many of the same ideas, and then the revolutions in Latin America, and the revolution in Greece, and revolutions, in various other parts of the country, of the world. And in some respect, as Bob points out, if you wear your revolutionary clothes and you show up on January 6th, 2021, you say, we are the Stand Back rebels of the time. It's, what does self-government mean? And how, and this, of course, is something that is played out in American history. Once you've established the idea that the British no longer rule in America, then who does rule in America? And will it be state by state? So will George Washington become simply the greatest man in Virginia? Or will he take something larger than that? Well, we got to jump the Articles of Confederation, write the Constitution to affirm that. And then is it just a one-way street into the Constitution, into the Union? Do we allow people to back out? No, apparently not, during the 1860s. And so this is, again, when I teach undergraduates, when I teach 18 and 19-year-old students in my survey, I try to break things down into sort of simple principles that apply very broadly. And one of the simplest principles is, how do you balance the interests of the individual against the interests of the community? How do you weigh liberty against security, and this sort of thing? And there are answers that seem logical, maybe even compelling at a particular moment in history, but conditions change, and it's also the case in human affairs that an idea that seems like a good idea almost always gets pushed beyond the point at which it's a good idea, and then there's a pushback. But yeah, there's no question about what was going on in America was part of this very much larger phenomenon. One last thing, that somebody about 10 or 15 years ago wrote a book called, I think it was The Declaration of American History, the Declaration of Independence in World History, or something like that. I just remember because I happened to review the book, but it was a striking thing that the American Declaration has been plagiarized, ribbed, borrowed by dozens of countries around the world. The ideas stand up pretty well. When Ho Chi Minh was looking for a model for Declaration of Independence for Vietnam, he asked the CIA, he goes, OSS contact, can you get me a copy of the American Declaration of Independence? The Texas Declaration of Independence of 1836 is cribbed from the US Declaration of Independence.
I have a question. Yeah, a comment and a question. One is and it's kept coming up in the question of discussion and commentary, is the fact whether we can talk about an American identity in any of these characters, whether the actual title is the 13 civil wars, original 13 civil wars, and why there weren't any civil wars in Jamaica or Barbados or the Nova Scotia. Why not 17 civil wars, only 13? And what led to the construction of an American identity? Of course, there was none. As you said, Washington saw himself as a Virginian, not as an American, or Franklin saw himself as a Pennsylvanian, or well, a member of the British Empire in Pennsylvania. So when the category of American really emerges.
Can I just add something to that question from our online audience that I think it fits really well? It's, they also asked to expand on the idea that the American Revolution was a conflict among Americans themselves. So I think that kind of complements that.
Yeah, that it wasn't.
No, they want to kind of ask a person from the audience, Kiki Jain, is kind of wants to know what does this mean? Like there's a conflict among Americans. What does that mean?
Yeah, that assumes that the category exists.
Yeah.
Could I just
Sure.
jump in here? I mean, the answer in part to that, Jorge, it seems to me is this, that you begin to see this articulation of the idea of America in relationship to Virginia in, early 1600s. And that's in contradistinction to the notion of the Indies, which encompasses by and large, as the British see it, and as many of these colonial spokespersons in the early 1600s, as they articulate. And Virginia, you got to remember, Virginia is not Virginia. Virginia is Virginia. Virginia encompasses virtually all of North America. And so there's a entanglement in between the term Virginia and what America is, and American in the 1600s, which lives on. Now these other, the other colonies contest this to some degree, given their own sense of their provincialism, their provincial identity. But nonetheless, that idea is there. Why there aren't more? There's a kind of a coherence, if you will, again, and shared interest in the various colonies, if you will, on North America, on the mainland, which doesn't extend, despite the traffic between Barbados and Jamaica and so on, and South Carolina. But there is that kind of sense of separation, it seems to me, which grows out of this sense of America, Virginia. And it's in contradistinction, as I say, to the Indies. That's an arguable position. That's all I would say. Can I just answer? Can I speak to this for a second? If there isn't another question. Your point is really interesting. Again, Bill deals with this in part on page 80 in here. Here's John Adams. All right. Reputation ought to be the perpetual subject of my thoughts. All right. An aim of my behavior. All right. The means, not the end, was now the question. How shall I gain a reputation? All right, this runs through it, and he goes on. This is a wonderful kind of expression of self-interest and self-promotion and so on. That's right here. As for the issue of patriotism, which you raised, that whole issue of what patriotism means in the 1750s and the 1760s, it's in many ways tied to the notion of the Patriot King. And the Bolingbroke book, it's a monarchical kind of expression in a lot of ways. And you can argue that kind of interpretation of patriotism informs loyalism, if you will, and it informs the continuing desire within American polity in the 1780s, 1790s, and so on, for a kind of monarchical arrangement of some sort. It's not everybody's happy with, we're still trying to tangle with the issue of what kind of republic this is. And it's the old story. Washington had wanted to be a dictator. Alexander Hamilton would have held his horse.
Right.
There's that element, and that echoes, it seems to me. And I think you deal with that really in a great way in this book by, pointing out at the end of the book, Washington, you can take your runs at him, and I'll come back to that in a second, but this is the guy who, he resigns. It's the Newburgh conspiracy. These were big kind of, and here you get back to the issue of integrity.
Yeah.
It's not morality, it's integrity, But if I can add one thing though, may I?
I'd like to hear from Bill, the 13.
I'll get that.
There's Alan Taylor's interpretation of the American Revolution, that is American Revolution.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a plural civil wars here, and why does it matter to have that interpretation as opposed to Americans?
Well, we can't stop Alan when he's about to be a passage from.
No, I mean, the fact is, I mean, the Taylor view is sure, there are revolutions, there's no question about it, and there's a fragmentation. But all that does, I mean, that's been around for a long time. I mean, fundamentally, there's this fragmentation that exists. And these are separate kinds of societies in their own way. Now it gets more complicated as you get into the 1780s and the 1790s because the movement of peoples again, and crossing of boundaries. And one of the things that is in fact in the Articles of Confederation, it's the right to expatriation, which means crossing of boundaries in some way. So you have both, in fact, and that's part of the tension. I don't think Taylor's wrong, but I just don't think it's I don't think it takes us very far, to be honest, beyond the obvious thing. But if I can say the one thing that drives me up the wall, Bill, the only thing in this book that really drives me.
Oh, wait, so you read it that way?
Yeah,
No,
yeah.
we'll read that.
I hear you say, because I want to get this in, you're at the end, you're talking about how wonderful George Washington is. I agree with all of it. But then you say to resume his life as a farmer. And that drives me crazy. You see that in American historiography all the time. Washington is not a farmer. I come from a farm background, let me tell you, and he's not a farmer. This guy owns 300 slaves. He's a planter. He's interested in agricultural kinds of innovation and so on. But he bloody well is not out there as a farmer, what I would call a farmer anyway. And I think this is, sort of the perpetuation of the celebratory notion of what Washington is, this kind of ordinary guy. I mean, look, okay, look who he married.
Point taken.
So don't perpetuate that myth.
All right, okay. In answer to your question, all right. So what was it that allows us to call it a single revolution rather than 13 revolutions, or what unifying forces are at play here?
Well, the category of American as if.
Yeah, okay, so I would say the principal thing that created this category of American was the war itself. Because wars do have this tendency to cause people to pull together. Those people who have chosen one side, they have every incentive to ally with one another in the service of this common goal. And you see this in the case of the American Revolution. I would say that if it had been the design of the British to prevent the emergence of an American identity, they should have just said upon the Declaration of Independence, okay, you got it, we're not going to contest it. And then the delegates to the Continental Congress would have gone home, and the Virginians would have had very little to say to the Pennsylvanians, to the Massachusetts, and to the New Yorkers. And it might very well have fallen apart on its own. But the fact is that it took 8 years of fighting for this independence movement to succeed. It was not an accident that George Washington's army was called the Continental Army. It was made up initially of groups from different states, but it was the Continental Army, and it was the Continental Congress, and the people who were behind this movement had every desire, every incentive to get these folks on their side to think continentally. And it worked as long as there was this foreign enemy. The Continental Congress worked pretty well, even in the last phase under the Articles of Confederation, as long as there was this foreign enemy. Take away the foreign enemy, once Britain says, okay, you're independent, then it starts to fall apart. And then the delegates from the people from the different states, they begin to think more of their states than of this union as a whole. And then it requires a reset with the writing of the Constitution, which is this nationalist enterprise to make Americans think and act like Americans rather than as individuals from the separate states. And there's this metaphorically bloody battle between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists to see, is this new form of government going to be adopted? But there is this tension in the American system, certainly in its original form, right up through the Civil War. Is there an exit clause? Is there a backdoor in the Constitution? And the answer was no, but this answer was imposed on the South. It wasn't something the South agreed to. And we still fight over this question of what aspects of government are best left to the states, what aspects are best handled by the federal government. This is both the genius and the curse of this federal system, which raises one of the questions that I present to my students, because for the students, all this stuff is new, and this is ancient history. They inherited it, but they had no role in establishing it. So I sort of asked them, and I put it mostly as a rhetorical question, but if somebody were going to create a new government, if you had a new country today, would you create a system like the one the United States has, where there is this constant battle between states and the central government? Wouldn't you at least lay it out more clearly? And the answer is, well, mostly no. But on the other hand, Germany, West Germany, and then Germany has fairly loose connections between, there's more autonomy for the different states in Germany than there is in many other countries. But, and this gets back to this fundamental philosophical question of politics. What's the role of the community? What's the role of the individual? And there are times when the community is more important and necessary, typically during war, when there's a foreign enemy. When there's no foreign enemy, then things go well, then the individual parts can operate more separately. So it's a question that continues. And so if the American Revolution is our first civil war, then the Civil War is really the last act of the revolution in determining what this new thing consists of. Because until then, there wasn't a definitive, essentially agreed upon answer to the question, is this primarily America, or is it a bunch of separate states? And the position of the North, the Union, is it's America, and you're going to accept this. And you can see this a little bit just in the usages. So when Thomas Jefferson writes the Declaration of Independence, he speaks of these United States, this plural entity. But once you get to the Civil War and beyond, the United States is construed primarily as singular. This United States, it's the United States is, rather than the United States are. So it's an ongoing problem.
This sort of gets back to the point you made at the beginning about George Washington making a choice, and I would almost dispute that. I'd say Washington would say, I stood my ground.
Yes.
Virginia had this position in the empire, it governed itself. It's Britain, the parliament, that's innovating, claiming rights or powers it never had, or at least had lost by lack of exercise. And I remember I was at a conference once and we were talking about royalism. And I asked this question about, like, did they feel any qualms? All of these guys had sworn oaths to the king,
Right?
Because it all served in the colonial government. Did they have any qualms about breaking this Bible oath? And the answer, which is interesting, was, I mean, Jefferson famously said, it was like changing clothes, like taking off a coat, putting on a new one, there was no problem. But the answer at the conference was, their understanding was that the king had broken his oath to them when he declared them to be outside of his protection and in rebellion. That was in December of 1775. And so therefore, basically, right, their oaths were null and void at that point.
Yeah.
So well, they would say, I've basically stayed here, and it's Britain who's moved. Right.
Well, you remember when Ronald Reagan was president, and Reagan used to joke about his age as a way of neutralizing the concerns that he was too old. And he would talk about, well, when I knew George Washington, things like this. And well, Ronald Reagan famously switched parties. And he had been a lifelong Democrat until he became a Republican. And he said, I didn't leave the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party left me. But I think it's relatively rare. I'm quite willing to be corrected on this. But many revolutions, maybe most revolutions, actually avow a fundamental conservatism. Yeah. Because they're preserving values that allegedly have been lost or betrayed by somebody else. So it's the most it's in the same way that no country, however aggressive, ever says, we're launching an aggressive war. It's always a defense in depth or something like that. Or Russia is defending its southern border by invading Ukraine. So all wars are defensive, all revolutions are conservative of something or other. And so then the question is, so how seriously do they take this? It makes sense to pay lip service to this, but I do think that is actually fundamentally correct. And this goes to something else. And it may be the simplest way of explaining the American Revolution. And it's sort of the old benign neglect idea that various groups left England from the early 17th century to the early 18th century, and they got used to pretty much governing their own affairs. Because in contrast to the French overseas empire and the Spanish overseas empire, these weren't government-sponsored things. These were government-tolerated things. And the government said, okay, go out there and do what you're going to do. And they were left pretty much on a loose leash for a long time. I mean, there were navigation laws and things like this. And when Britain went to war, then the colonies were expected to participate. But there wasn't the kind of intrusion that the colonists in the 1760s first detected at a level that really caused them to take some action. So yeah, they could say, things have been going fine here for 150 years. If you had just left us that way, with the idea that we're gonna levy our own taxes, and don't you come to the outside and tell us to do that. So in that regard, I think there really was this sense that this deal that we had with the British government has been violated by the British. And some would take it so far as to say the King's oath to us has been violated if they take their own oath very seriously. But that notion that there's a change being made, there's a change being imposed on us by the British government and we don't like it, and we're going to resist it. And that might be as good an explanation for a lot of this as anything else. Now, there are enthusiasts of rebellion, the Sam Adams types, who really get into this kind of thing. But for a lot of them, and I think this is one of the reasons that at a certain point, there is a psychological advantage to the Patriot side, because they can just say, if you go with us, we're going to let you keep doing what you're doing. If you accept British interpretations of things, you're going to be paying new taxes, there's this new regime you're going to have to deal with. And so we are the voices of conservatism in this. And then, needless to say, there's this whole long debate about how revolutionary was the American Revolution, was a conservative revolution, was this, that, and the other thing. And this is a case where there were multiple revolutions, but they weren't all identified in different states. It's just sort of different people and what they expected. And also what Alan was talking about, where you sort of back yourself into democracy, by, okay, well, we cut off the king's head, then what do we do? We don't have the peers, we don't have the equivalent of that. And so all that's left is this other thing. And sort of one last thing on this subject is, when wars begin, people have certain expectations. But what happens in the wars almost always defies many or most of those expectations. So between the starting point of the war and the ending point of the war, you often, the people involved have sort of no idea where it's going to go. They know that it's going to end with one side getting its way on maybe the basic issue. But where you land on that distant shore is probably far beyond anything you can imagine.
More questions?
I have kind of paradox, I guess. This gets the two civil wars together.
Yeah, okay.
That during the American Revolution, the revolutionaries hated, they did not want to be called rebels.
Right.
They denied it. They were insulted. Rebellion is a sin. They disowned that. Whereas the Confederates, who ostensibly would say, this isn't even a revolution because the states have always been sovereign.
Right.
They embraced the term rebel. So
I mean, that's an interesting question, except that, I mean, this is, one hesitates to ascribe too much to this, but in much of, call it Southern Confederate thinking, there was this idea that nobody dictates to us. And there was this rebelliousness of spirit. They wouldn't acknowledge that they were rebels against the Constitution, but just the idea that outsiders don't get to tell us what to do. There is that kind of rebellious aspect. And maybe it could be the Scots-Irish, in that long belt. They're used to having their own way, defying anybody who makes them do otherwise. But you're right. I mean, it is very interesting.
Yeah.
So what about the trajectory of identity of free blacks? I mean, in the case of trajectory of identity of whites in this first Civil War, you can see moving from provincial identity to an American identity through 10 years. Right? But in the case of blacks, I mean, this is the question. I know that they end up calling themselves Africans because there's no room for them to be called Americans. There's no citizenship. But they begin how? They begin with what are the identities they have locally in these 13 colonies? Virginians, South Carolinians, and they wind up calling themselves Africans. What is the trajectory of identities for blacks and also for Native Americans, if you know?
It's an interesting question. I don't focus on any free black men or women in the story. I do focus on two enslaved black men who, one of the points that I made earlier, and I do in the book, is that in a certain sense, everybody had to choose, even the people who one would think didn't have a choice in the matter. But once the British government made policy to offer freedom to the slaves of rebel masters, then those slaves to whom this potentially applied had to think about this. And one of the individuals that I write about is a man named Boston King, who was a slave in South Carolina. And he had to make this decision. And the decision is conditioned by a lot of things. And interesting, in his case, there's this element of what I call the little history that comes on board, because he was the son of a skilled slave. And as the kid of this relatively favored slave man on the plantation, he described by his own testimony that he had a relatively privileged upbringing. He got to play, didn't have to work very hard. And he expected he would become skilled. He was training, basically apprenticed to be a carpenter. And he was comparatively satisfied with his lot in the sense, and this is crucial, in the sense that he could not conceive of any reasonable chance that he could better it. And so he wasn't the first one to accept the British offer of join the British Army and we'll get you freedom at the end of the war. But eventually he found himself in a position where I'm able to write about him because he wrote his memoir later. And he was talking about, he was on this job as a carpenter, and he was told to, while the other workers were going to lunch, he was supposed to stay on the site and guard the supply of nails. And nails were expensive and therefore valuable at that time. And he somehow got distracted or something and the nails disappeared. And he knew that he was going to be blamed for the theft of the nails. And so he wasn't going to incur that false allegation. So he decides he's going to leave and he goes off and he joins the British Army.
Who's going to be blamed and whipped?
Yeah, oh yes, and he is punished very badly. Yeah, exactly. So now it's that little thing that says, okay, this adds up to, I'm leaving. And so he risks his life crossing the lines, fighting the British side and all this. So, and now in his case, so he is one of the group they're called the Black Loyalists. And at the end of the war, he is, after the Battle of Yorktown, when everybody's waiting to see the terms of the Treaty of Paris, what is going to be done with the Loyalists? And complicating the thing for the former slaves is what's going to be done with confiscated property. Are they going to be treated as loyalists, as people? Are they going to be treated as property or what? And the terms of the treaty say that the American government is going to make every effort to return confiscated property. And Boston King and there's several hundred of these Black Loyalists. And they read this and they, oh my God, we're going to be sold back, given back into slavery. But fortunately for them, the British did not abide by this part of the treaty, and they send them all away. And one of the last parts of the story here that I think is actually crucial to our understanding, or maybe our lack of understanding, of some of the complications of this story is that at the end of the American Revolution, in contrast to, say, the revolution in France or a lot of revolutions, the losers had an exit strategy. They could leave. And tens of thousands, perhaps as many as 100,000 loyalists left. And so they basically fall off the radar of American history as American history. And occasionally people will tell their story, but almost nobody has any incentive to remember them very well. Because from the standpoint of the winners, the Patriot side, they want to develop the mythology that the Americans rose up as one against the British. And these few discontented types, they were traitors that we won't talk about. You know, they're not gonna publicize the fact that there were hundreds of thousands of them. And on the part of the British, well, the British feel kind of badly about it because they do not particularly do well by these people who risk their lives on behalf of the British government. So a bunch of them go to Canada, some of them go to the West Indies, some of them go to England, but they kind of wind up like William Franklin, Joseph Galloway, who were just, please don't remind us of you. It's a little bit like, and I try to draw analogies for my students, it's a little bit like the treatment in the United States of Vietnam vets, who they came home from this failed war. They never got a victory parade because, of course, there was no victory. And it was also very convenient for a lot of people in forgetting the war, just don't be reminded of the people who were involved in the war. I would add that just before the book came out, so a year ago in August, the book came out in October or November, I think, there was the US evacuation of Afghanistan. And we all observed how messily wars end. And especially a war where there is a faction in the country that has been fighting on behalf of this foreign group. This is the United States and the Afghans who fight on the side of the United States. And how many of them get out? What happens to those who don't get out? And we saw the images of people trying to get to the airport and get on the planes and all this. And we don't have, obviously, video or photographs of the Black loyalists and the other loyalists who had congregated in New York by the end of the war. And they all pile on board the ships and sail away. And so it changes the dynamics if they're not left there to be dealt with.
It's true that they disappear from the stage, except Canada, of course, Upper Canada celebrates loyalists, the United Empire loyalists, very proud to have loyalist
Sure,
ancestry.
right.
And also there's a recent book by Maya Jasanoff about loyalists, the Liberty's Exiles,
Right,
it's called.
right. Yeah.
And she has a neat point that a lot of the guys are leaving America. They don't really have any roots in Britain. So a lot of them go into the empire and they become very prominent in India, especially in the military of the East India Company, because they have military experience. So there's kind of the American loyalists become almost like
And
imperial
so Boston
fixers.
King, this former slave, winds up in Sierra Leone.
Right.
You know, so
If I can, I wanna just emphasize, again, the messiness of this world. And I want to give you, a couple of examples. One that always comes to mind is, for 2 years, basically, Boston was occupied by British troops, 2,000 of them on a population of 14,000. All right, think about that for a minute. 14,000 people, that includes younger people as well as adults. 14,000 people, and you throw 2,000 troops into this for 2 years. Now, you know very well, the civilian population is going to provide services, both food, water, clothing, sex, whatever. It gets really complicated. And then, troops move out. What happens? Where do these people go? What's the world that they enter into? Like, it's this messy kind of set of relationships that are there. And you can pick up a strand here and there of some woman, for example, who marries a British officer and goes out to the West Indies for a while, then comes back, maybe tries to claim property that she's owned before the revolution and so on. The other thing is that it's easy to forget that New York was occupied basically throughout the war. And there's a whole area in New York and in New Jersey, which is inhabited by people who are moving back and forth, and who again, provide services of one kind or another. The British Army, of course, has money, so people will sell things. You cross lines and so on. It's again this incredible mess that is there, which is part of this this civil war that is there. Those scars, they last for a long period of time. I don't know, Bill, because you've read the diplomatic stuff closer than I have, and actually you've got some really good stuff at the end, I think, at all of this. But why did the British not want to stay and keep New York? You ever run anything about that? They had the damn place all the time. They were up in Newport as well, Rhode Island, but the big, how are you gonna, well, maybe too, I don't know.
Well, there was, you mentioned this, that in 1780, 81, everybody's tired of war on both sides of the ocean. And the other European states are sick of British Royal Navy messing with their trade. So they start this armed neutrality that's really trying to impose a ceasefire. Which would be on the basis of you get to keep what you have. British wouldn't have to grant independence. They would just stop fighting. And at that point, Britain would have New York and Long Island and large parts of the South. And Adams is very worried that basically the Americans are going to be forced to accept this. Because the Americans are totally relying on the French. And if the French say, we're tired of paying for this also, this is the best deal you're going to get. So he was worried that this might happen. And in some ways, Yorktown is important because it forecloses that possibility that if the war had continued, there would have been some kind of ceasefire armistice.
Yeah.
So that's on the table a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think by the end, the British just really, we just gotta get out of this. And if the Americans are gonna insist and the French are gonna allow them to insist.
And if you look at the way British policy developed in the next century, I think maybe in the 1780s, there was the beginning of the idea that we can get what we really want out of empire without having the empire itself, what would come to be called the British Empire Free Trade. And we can have, if in fact, obviously the Americans don't like us as things are, but they might need us. So we make nice to the Americans, and then we will make customers out of the Americans, just as they've been our customers before. And this is the policy that the British largely follow in Latin America through much of the 19th century. You don't need the formal colonies anymore. You can get most of the benefits of that without the costs, without the headaches of it. And certainly in the thinking of people like Alexander Hamilton, yeah, that's a great idea. We'll do exactly that. Which kind of gets back to what really was this all about? Was this just a power struggle to see who gets to say, we're in charge here? Because since certainly the beginning of the 20th century, after it took a while for the Americans to get over this Anglophobia that comes out of the Revolution and the War of 1812. But the US and Britain have ideas regarding world affairs, ideas regarding the way you govern at home. They're pretty closely parallel. And it does kind of make you wonder, what would have happened if no American Revolution? When would American independence have occurred? There's no way. I mean, the United States would not be part of the British Empire today. There's too much else that happens. Would the United States have evolved the way Canada did? And eventually the British would just say, okay, go ahead and do it. That's a tough case to make, because one of the reasons the British decided what they did was so the US wouldn't swallow up Canada. But who knows? Anyway.
Well, on that
Great
note
thought.
of skepticism, we'll end. Thank you very much for the conversation, the interventions of the panelists, the audience. Thank you, everyone, and see you after Thanksgiving.